Hello there, ESL 0102 students. This is Professor Holly again, and we're going to continue talking about modals. Last time we talked about what modals are and what quasi-modals are, the verb-like phrases that do some of the same jobs as modals. But now we're going to start diving a little bit deeper into the different meanings that modals can convey. Here we're talking about advice and regret. And if you're following along, you can look at Unit 7 in your textbook. So advice and regret. We've got three true modals that we use to talk about advice and regret, and we've got a couple of quasi-modals, again, verb phrases. So the modals that we use for advice and regret are could, should and should not, might and might not, and might want to. We can also use, and also might not want to. And these are for expressing advice in the present or the future. If we want to talk about a regret, or what our book calls past advice, or if we want to criticize something that somebody did or didn't do, we would use should or should not, plus have, plus the past participle form. Okay, and we'll see some examples on the next slide. Now, the quasi-modals that do the same jobs ought to, and notice here I don't have a negative, and that's because in American English we don't use the negative nearly as often as it is used in the British English. And we can also use had better and had better not. Now, everything that's on here is followed by the base form of the verb. So you could talk to an advisor. You should buy a new car. You might or might not want to go to New York this weekend. You ought to talk to an advisor. You had better see a doctor about that cough. All right, so all of them are followed by the base form of the verb. We learned that in the first presentation. And again, if we're talking about a past regret, again, what our book calls past advice, or a criticism of somebody else, I can use ought to plus have plus the past participle. But once again, we're not going to use ought to with the negative nearly as often in American English. So let's get on to some examples. Again, with our true modals, I've got you could talk to an advisor. Now, this is very weak. In fact, it's not saying whether or not you think it's a good idea or a bad idea. You're just really giving somebody an option. So if somebody asks you what to do and you don't have a strong opinion one way or another, you might want to use could. So yeah, you could do that if you want to. That way, if they do it and it doesn't work, they're not going to come back to you and yell and say, you told me that I should do this. And you say, no, I said you could do it. It's a little bit different. So again, here it's very neutral. You're not giving your own opinion. And notice here that I don't use it in the negative. If I use it in the negative, it changes the meaning completely. It's no longer related to giving advice. If I say you should talk to an advisor or should not talk to an advisor, this is giving true advice. I'm giving you my opinion. I think it's a good idea, or I think it's a bad idea. This is probably the most commonly used modal for giving advice. And again, if you want to be either extremely polite, or if you want to just give very weak advice, maybe a step above could, but definitely under should in terms of how strongly you feel, you can use might or might want to. So, hey, you might want to talk to an advisor, or you might not want to talk to an advisor at Largo. You might want to talk to an advisor at UTC instead. So again, very polite advice. So something maybe you would give to an elder in your community or to a boss, or if you just wanted to be especially polite for some reason, or again, if you're not certain about your advice, if you don't feel strongly about it, go with might or might want to. And again, I can use this in the negative as well if I want to. You might want to, you might not want to. And again, sometimes I might just say might. You might talk to an advisor, you might not talk to an advisor. As for me, myself, I don't use just might nearly as often as I say might want to. I use might want to every day because I was raised to be a very polite person. I don't know. Anyway, the quasi-modals. I can use ought to. Ought to has the same meaning as should. So these are pretty much equivalent. I'd say that these are pretty much equal. So you ought to talk to an advisor. You should talk to an advisor. I'd use those interchangeably. But again, American English doesn't use the negative nearly as often. So I probably won't say, and you won't hear a lot of us say, you ought not talk to an advisor. British will use that far more. So we'll go with should when it's negative. All right. And the last thing we're going to talk about in here is had better. Had better is very strong. It's a warning. So if I say you had better talk to an advisor, it implies a small threat that something bad will happen if you don't. So again, because it's very strong, you want to be careful when and where you use it. It's not appropriate for all audiences. All right. As a mom, I would say to my kid, you had better get your homework done right now. But I'm not necessarily going to go to my boss and say, hey, you had better hire a new person. That would be a little bit too strong in that social situation. Again, that's my opinion, but had better does convey a warning, so be a little bit careful when you use it. Here are a few more examples of where we can talk about advice and regret. Again, when we're talking about advice or regret in the past, we're going to use the perfect form of our modals, what we learned in our very first presentation. So you're going to have your subject, you're going to have, well, should not, plus have, plus your past participle. And again, should and should not have, those are probably the most commonly used. You should have talked to an advisor. That means you didn't do it and it was bad. This is a type of criticism. Okay? You should not have talked to an advisor. That means you did do it and for some reason it was bad. Maybe you talked to the wrong advisor, you got some wrong information. I can also use ought to in the perfect. You ought to have, we would say ought to have. You ought to have talked to an advisor. Again, that means you did not, and that was bad. But notice again, I'm not going to use the negative. All right, ought not to have or something. It's just not nearly as common. So I would say just go with the should not have. But again, should have in the affirmative, ought to have in the affirmative, same meaning. Again, if your subject is first person, I or we, I'm expressing regret. I didn't do something and I'm sorry that I did it, or I did do something and I regret doing it. Could be either one of those. If you're using second person or third person, you're criticizing the other person. All right, you're saying that what they did essentially was not a good idea. So here in this silly little picture, this poor kitty was trying to climb up in the cabinet and knock down a bowl of water. You can see the cat has regret. The cat should not have tried to climb the cabinet. So the cat did, and now it's all wet. Okay, take a couple of minutes and jot down in your notebook what you think these 5 different sentences mean. When you have an idea, you can start up the presentation again and see if you're right. And when you're doing it, you'll notice that these have pretty much the same main verb, take. All right, take, take, take. And in this case, taken, because I'm using the perfect form. The only thing that's changing is the helping verb. So you could take the GW Parkway. Again, remember, could only used in the affirmative when you're giving advice. You're really just emphasizing it's an option. You're not saying whether or not it's a good idea or a bad idea. So if somebody's saying, hey, how can I get to Alexandria from Bethesda? I'd say, well, you could take the GW Parkway. You could take Cabin John Parkway and then hop on, what is that, 295. You could take the Beltway all the way around. So really, it's emphasizing an option, but not saying what's the best. You should take the GW Parkway. That is me giving you my opinion. If it's affirmative, it means I think it's a good idea. I think it's the best option. If I had said you shouldn't, then I think it's a bad option. You ought to take. So again, we would say you oughta, same as you should. I'm telling you, I think it's a good idea. You had better take the GW Parkway. That's the strongest that I would put here. Remember that had better includes a warning. So if I say you had better take that, means if you take another road, you're going to regret it. Something bad's going to happen. You're going to be in bad traffic, or you're going to be delayed, or something like that. And then you should have taken the GW Parkway. This last one that I have here, remember, is expressing regret or criticism. Because I'm saying it to you, you should have taken. I'm expressing criticism. I'm saying, you didn't do it, and it's bad that you didn't do it. You took something else. You took the Beltway, and it took you an hour, and you had to pay tolls, and now you're wishing you'd taken the GW Parkway. All right, so again, I'm expressing a criticism of what you did or didn't do. And our book calls this past advice. All right, you've got a little bit of homework to do. The information in here is for our second edition of the textbook. So in your textbook, I just want you to review pages 100 and 101 and keep going from there. Do the exercises that are in those pages, especially 2.1, 2.2, and 2.3. Check your answers in the key. If you've got your online workbook, start working on the Unit 7 exercises as well. And just remember, homework that's in the textbook does not have to be submitted. You check your answers in your key, and if you have questions, then you can post your questions in our Module 1 discussion board. All right, are you ready for our second quiz? We've got a second quiz to do. Check 2. The password for this one is hello. Just like with every comprehension check in my class, you can do it as often as you need to, so that you can learn and understand the grammar and learn from your mistakes. Again, make sure you do it before you move on, and absolutely get it done before the end of the module. And then once you've done everything else that I mentioned in this lecture, go ahead and download your self-study worksheet. All right, there's a worksheet you can do. Complete it using the grammar that you've learned. I've put sample answers on a separate handout that you can download as well. Compare your answers. And if you've got questions, you can either bring them to our next live review session, or you can post them on the discussion board for us to answer. All right, my friends, this is the end of our second mini lecture. I'll see you online, and have a great day.